All right. Okay, so I have 6:01. So we will, people will still be dribbling in, I bet, but let's get started. So again, thanks to everybody for coming. My name is Lisa Musgrove, and I am a librarian at the Roanoke Park County Library with the Sonoma County Library System. And behind the scenes is my colleague, Monica Samantha, and she will be running the film and running some of the other behind the scenes technical stuff to make this program go smoothly. A few reminders for today's event. We have turned off the chat for the program, so there's no camera or microphone for audience members. First, we are going to hear from the directors of the film, then play the film for everyone. Audio is in English and captions are in Spanish. We will then have 30 minutes for questions and answers with our directors, and a select panel of from Firewise Sonoma County that we will introduce later. If you have questions for the panel, please ask it in the question and answer feature, and we will do our best to get to it as time allows. Also, this event is being recorded. The filmmakers have generously allowed us to keep it recorded and keep it available for about 2 weeks after the event, which is just fabulous. Thank you so much. It'll be posted on the library's YouTube page later this week. So thanks again, everybody. And I'm going to now welcome the film directors, producers, and writers, Stephen Most and Kevin White, who will introduce the film. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Lisa. Kevin, would you like to do an introduction?
Sure. Thank you, Lisa. We're thrilled to be here. And it's great. As you may or may not know, we actually filmed in Sonoma during the so-called wine country fires. And there's a section about that in the film. I'm kind of a fan of showing the film and talking about it later, but I will say that when we made this film, we were trying to look at, back in 2013, we started, it was like the phenomena of so-called mega fires, wild big fires. And we, catastrophic fires of 100,000 acres or more. And now, sadly, that is something I think everybody in the West and frankly, entire world is very aware of. And so we can talk more about, what we've learned in this process, which is to say a lot, actually. And looking forward to having a conversation with the panelists as well about ways that we can live with wildfire more sustainably, and taking into account, that a changing climate and where we have our homes. So I guess we'll start the film and then we can just talk afterwards.
In the western United States, I believe something like 5 or 6 states within the last 10 years have had the largest wildfires they've ever had on record. Fires which exceed any of the kind of previous experience we've had with the size, intensity, ferocity of fires up until this last decade or so.
Says the heavy cloud of smoke parked over much of LA and beyond, blocking the sun, making the air so thick, air quality officials issued a smoke advisory.
What's going on in the background of all of this is you have climate change, which is constantly pushing the conditions to be drier, the fuels to be drier, the weather to be more extreme.
Oh, you can feel the heat. This is crazy.
There just simply aren't enough firefighters to help fight this fire because of the sheer number of fires and also the size.
We're seeing large fires in landscapes born and bred of fire now being destroyed by fire.
My name is Kevin White. Like many Westerners, I grew up loving the outdoors. I've seen many changes in our forests and streams during my lifetime, some of which I've documented as a filmmaker. My family has a cabin in the Sierra Nevada, not far from where the Rim Fire burned 400 square miles in 2013. Little did I realize that this would be a harbinger of wildfires to come that would have impacts far beyond the Sierra.
That out-of-control wildfire in Yosemite, now one of the biggest in California history. It is roughly the size of Chicago, so big they can see it on the International Space Station.
I saw this 20,000-foot column of smoke rise up like an atomic bomb. At that point, I knew this thing had gone from a bad fire to a catastrophic fire.
The steepness and the fire behavior in there, this is something I'll always remember for the rest of my career, for sure.
Yeah, this is Dante's Inferno. There's just nothing that is going to stop this.
We knew we were dealing with a very unique event when this fire grew roughly 50 to 70,000 acres in a day. I think at one point we probably had close to 5,000 or 6,000 people that were working on this fire. Helicopters and air tankers, hotshot crews, firefighters from all over the nation were here to help us out. It became a very explosive situation to where there was nothing humanly possible that we could do except to make sure that people were out of the way and they were evacuated and they were safe.
As the fire really got going and it became quite clear that this was going to be more than just another typical wildfire, people got really scared. And I'd say 2/3 just left the hill, and rightfully so.
Jerry Baker has a camp for developmentally disabled youth. The Rim Fire blew up in the canyon just below his backyard.
The fire started right at the river, at the bottom of that drainage. And then over the next day, it worked its way to the top of this hill and actually burned all the way right to the peak of Jawbone Ridge. Then the fire broke over at the top of the Tuolumne River. And in 20 minutes, it had completely taken over this hill. It's very difficult to express the power of a wildfire. As it came up over the horizon behind me here, it just was a giant wall of red. We had 12 fire engines and 80 firefighters standing at the ready. Crews with chainsaws and back-burning equipment. But the truth is, a fire that's this violent, you don't fight that with a hose. This day was so dramatic. There hadn't been anything besides the whop, whop, whop of helicopters for a while. The King Air came in, and immediately behind it comes the DC-10, basically at treetop. Dropping a load at exactly the right time, at exactly the right spot, and the fire just settled down. It was pretty dramatic at that point, and brought tears to all of our eyes, and almost does now, to think about the difference that second made when he dropped his load right over the pine trees behind us.
Not far from Tuolumne Trails is Berkeley's Tuolumne Camp. Since 1922, the camp was an annual tradition for thousands of families. I went there several times myself as a kid.
For 90+ years, it was buzzing with people who were happy. We got a call from the sheriff, it's time to leave. You got 10 minutes, you gotta leave. The firefighters moved into camp that afternoon. And so the fire caught wind and got into camp too fast to be saved. And because it's a crown fire, it burned through camp and the tops of trees and then down very quickly. So this is cabin 46. I'm amazed that it's still standing, but it is pretty strange to see a chunk of it taken out and the rest of it left standing. And it feels almost like your heart, that it just came in and they ripped your heart out but left the rest of you alone. One of the former staff people put out on Facebook, "I'm devastated. If anybody wants to join me, I'm going to be at the city park behind City Hall." 2,000 people came to the park that night. And they started singing a camp song. There's no place like camp to all of me. There's no spot that I would rather be. The swimming side of the hills are great. Those who come their joys relate.
For me, the rim fire raised important questions. What was different about this wildfire and others like it? And why is this happening now? I started this journey looking for answers in the Central Sierra.
The rim fire was a really good example of where a lot of scientists and forest managers believe wildfire is headed, which is to these really large size events, what's being termed mega fires.
I went with Malcolm north to the rim of the world, which gave the rim fire its name.
This Rim of the World overlook has a long history as being one of the main places that people would stop at on the way into Yosemite National Park. And you can see what happened to it from the rim fire in here. You've got areas that really burn very intensely, particularly these steeper slopes. There's very few trees even standing, and what we do have standing is clearly pretty dead at this point. Another problem that's a real concern with these large megafires is the extent of them. Because in the past, you would have had fire burning and killing groups of trees in small areas, 10 acres, maybe 20 acres. What's behind me is an area in which there's probably almost no live tree for 7 or 10 miles.
This whole area off to the south here burned in the 1987 complex fires, but only in
John Buckley, a former firefighter and now a forest ecologist, heads an environmental organization in the Central Sierra. As we drove along 25 miles of high-intensity burn, my heart sank. We reached Corral Creek, which meanders through an area that had been an old-growth forest before the rim fire struck.
So this is an example of one of the hot burned areas that's typical of this rim fire. It incinerated everything that was on the forest floor. It incinerated the ladder fuels, the bushes, the small trees, and it killed everything in the overstory, in the canopy. There are no trees in this entire 4.5-mile area that are left. These old-growth trees are irreplaceable. They're not something that could possibly be back in a single lifetime. There will not be recovery for some of these places, which doesn't just mean the trees. It means the northern flying squirrels, or the goshawks, or the pileated woodpeckers, or the California spotted owls, the fishers, the martins, the species that only survive in these older forest habitat areas. The single biggest negative impact is probably the lost forest cover for watershed purposes, because in the hot burned areas, it's not coming back.
The water that is stored as snow and filters through the soil of mountain forests brings life to the farms and cities of California. For San Francisco, the Tuolumne River is the principal source of water. As a city dweller, it was easy to forget we rely on the forest for our water, until the rim fire threatened the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir.
One of our biggest concerns was this going to affect our ability to deliver water? We deliver water to 2.6 million people in the San Francisco Bay Area. And there were lots of questions about, was the physical integrity of the facilities okay? What about the effect on water quality? You could tell this was a much different kind of emergency. The acreage was tripling every day. It was just growing explosively.
Okay, there's Hetch Hetchy and the Tuolumne river drainage. So you're actually flying over the rim fire, and as you look down, you can see where the crown of a lot of these trees were completely consumed by the fire.
Riding with Kelly Martin, Yosemite's chief of fire and aviation, I learned how forest conditions affect wildfires.
There's a number of different factors that come into play for a high-intensity fire to develop. The weather factors when the rim fire started. Again, peak of the fire season, very hot, very dry, windy, and an incredible amount of fuel buildup.
I realized what I see as a dense forest, Kelly sees as fuel for a wildfire. But not all of the rim fire was destructive. In many areas, the fire had beneficial impact in a forest that has evolved with fire.
So this is an area of the rim fire in which the fire actually came through here largely on the ground. These larger trees are adapted to the kind of low severity fire that burns along the surface, clearing out the competing vegetation, opening up seed beds for trees to become reestablished in. It's a real benefit to these systems and the type of fire that they evolved with for eons. This is an interesting example here where the fires really come through and really cleaned out the understory. It's consistent with the way fire used to burn in these stands historically. John Muir has a great quote that people often cite that says, historically, the Sierra forests were the kind that you could ride a horse through. Well, this is the kind of forest that you could easily ride a horse through.
John Muir believed that the Sierra forests were wild, and he wanted to preserve natural places like Yosemite from human impacts. Yet the mountain forests he encountered in the 19th century were frequently burned by California Indians. The meadows and open forests they maintained became overgrown when settlers removed the natives and their fires from the landscape.
The landscape that we saw during those early encounters that we so value was not a purely wild landscape in the sense of being natural landscape. It was a cultural landscape. It was the result of the interaction of people with nature, and perhaps most powerfully through fire. we used that capacity to see that the right kind of fire got on the landscape in the right way. And that kept wildfire, unwanted fire, under control.
Unlike John Muir, Gifford Pinchot saw the forest as a renewable resource that had to be conserved. In 1905, Pinchot founded the U.S. Forest Service to provide wood and water for a growing nation. Muir fought Pinchot over the fate of Hetch Hetchy Valley. Muir wanted it preserved as wilderness. Pinchot wanted it dammed to provide water and power for San Francisco. The valley became a reservoir. But in 1916, Muir's preservationist vision secured a federal home with the creation of the National Park Service.
Certainly the Forest Service has a different mission than the Park Service. So we don't do timber harvesting, we don't do cattle grazing in Yosemite in the wilderness. So we have more of a flexibility to use fire on the landscape as it was meant to be 100 years ago, because we don't have the conflict that we often see with commodities.
Sometimes, when the conditions are right, Kelly Martin lets the wildfires burn.
So this is the southern edge of the middle fire. This is deep in Yosemite's wilderness. This was a lightning-caused fire that started a couple months ago. It's behaved very well. It hasn't burned very fast, and a lot of this has just burned the surface fuels. So it's a very nice understory burn that really isn't burning it with very high intensity. But yet it's doing tremendous good by cleaning up a lot of this forest fuel on the floor. It's hard to help people understand, but I think the more folks like yourself that we get out here and really work with you to really see how good this fire is doing in this area, and you can see it. How else are you gonna reduce the fuels except through fire? So it's exciting for me to see how well this is actually burning, because I really did not expect it to burn this well. That's why I think the middle fire is really one of my favorite fires this year.
Historically, the Forest Service has had a different relationship to wildfire than the Park Service. It saw wildfire as a threat to the timber it managed.
(1910), 5 million acres or so burned on the national forest, who knows how much nationally. 78 firefighters died, a huge trauma for the agency.
By the 1930s, the Forest Service was practicing a fire suppression policy, calling for wildfires to be put out as soon as possible. The agency had declared war on wildfire.
One careless second with a match, and America the Beautiful becomes America the Ugly. Please, help prevent forest fires.
A lot of war surplus material. All of our air tanker fleet essentially came out of military surplus after World War II in Korea. So all of it reinforces this sense that we really are in a war on fire. We've got a fire industrial complex. We've got a whole private industry that's devoted to firefighting, which is now creating lobbies. And yet we know we can't win. Fire is going to happen. There is no possibility of putting this issue aside, tabling it. It is coming at us.
The icon of the Forest Service war on fire is Smokey Bear.
So remember, only you can prevent forest fires.
For decades, we've had one of the most effective advertising outreach messages out there, one that the Forest Service is rightfully very proud of, Smokey Bear.
Only you can prevent forest fires.
It is a very emphatic message. The problem is we have a history of putting fires out, and we've come to understand, particularly over the last several decades, that many of these forests evolve with frequent low-intensity fire.
Smokey has made millions of people careful about using fire in the forest. But he is also the public face of a century-old policy based on the idea that all forest fires are bad and should be prevented or suppressed.
Only you can prevent forest fires.
When they came out with Smokey Bear, he starved more bears out than he saved, Smokey Bear, because it took away a lot of the bear's food source. The huckleberries get choked out by these conifers that shade the huckleberry plant. Look, huckleberries are one of the main sources for our bears.
To learn about tribal fire management, I visited Tommy Wilson. He's a member of California's largest tribe, the Yuroks, who live in the Klamath River Basin.
When I was a young man, there was a lot of grasslands in this valley here. They're all been overtaken by conifer because of the lack of traditional cultural fire. I had two brothers. My grandmother, she used to give us a book of matches apiece. Said, go up on a hill, burn that hillside off. And that kept our world in balance. And the cop told us either we're gonna have to stop this or they threatened us to throw us in jail. We got too much fuel load on the ground that we get a catastrophic fire in here, we're in big trouble. We're in big trouble.
We are having larger fires because we are reaping the benefits of removing fire from the landscape. And so we've now set ourselves up to have landscapes very continuous in fuels, that when fires start 20 miles away, they literally can move all across that landscape in one burning period, one day.
I went to the Fire Sciences Lab in Missoula to find out how wildfire spreads.
Throughout human history, you're talking 500,000 years or something, people have been using fire. And yet we really haven't understood how fire spreads. How does fire behave?
Fire is like a liquid. It flows. Every wildfire is a unique mix of fuel, heat, weather, and topography. When it's windy, embers can travel for miles through forests or onto rooftops. This is how wildfires jump highways and take over entire landscapes.
We can introduce fairly frequent burning, either prescribed burning or a more tolerant approach to managing natural ignitions that encourages the presence of fire that's not destructive, in fact is very constructive for the forest and much in line with the way these forests evolved for millennia before Europeans arrived here.
It's a collaboration not only of firefighters but of also other Forest Service professionals that all come together and put together a plan in the long run. It's something that is going to be something healthy for our environment and safe for the public.
Think about under what conditions would we actually come back and try to burn, again, under hotter conditions. This is an area that has not burned in well over 100 years. And so when you look out here and you see this tremendous amount of fuel loading, the only way that this is going to get reduced is through fire. There's an art and there's a science to the use of fire on the landscape. And so over the course of any season, we spend a lot of time trying to understand the fuels, the weather, and the topography for just that right combination where fire is actually a very, very positive benefit for the environment.
Now you can really see the change in how much the fires really affected this slope.
We really have a scale now that's unlike anything we've seen before in terms of the need for fire on the landscape. Because if we don't get it now, it's only going to make these fires much larger and have much more devastating impacts on not only your life, but your children's lives and your grandchildren's lives in the future. If we don't do something now, the need is now, the need is immediate, and it's great, and it's significant.
The problem with prescribed fire is that where there's fire, there's smoke.
We know for sure that air quality and impacts of smoke to airports and schools and communities is a significant effect that we're going to see into the future. But if we don't accept some of that now, we're going to pay for it down the road because there will be so much smoke.
And what's going to happen if you keep fire out of the system is that eventually, when the wildfire does occur, it's going to release a lot more carbon into the atmosphere. And furthermore, the smoke that it puts out, you're not going to have any control when that smoke happens and where it goes.
Since the year 2000, wildfires in the United States have sent the equivalent of hundreds of billions of gallons of gas into the atmosphere. The rim fire alone released greenhouse gases equal to 1.2 billion gallons, according to the EPA, sending a plume of smoke from California to Canada and the Gulf of Mexico.
The smoke from forest fires in itself is a health hazard. If you can actually have planned burning, we know that as a matter of forest management, it will lead us to less of the kinds of fires that send people to the hospital.
The challenge is Congress has to provide the funding. I mean, it's a bottom line. People can be upset about wildfires, but if you don't have funding to do preventative work, the prescribed burning, the thinning logging, the shredding, you're going to have massive fires, and then taxpayers pay for the fire instead.
We have to spend a great deal of effort protecting lives and property. We saw some pretty devastating examples late this fire season in 2015, where over 2,000 homes were lost in two very devastating fires. That takes great effort to put resources in to protect the properties, protect lives.
More than 50 million people in the United States live in and around forests, grasslands, and shrublands in areas known as the WUI, the Wildland-Urban Interface. Much of that area is at high risk of wildfires. That became a reality for me when I needed to evacuate our cabin because of the Butte fire. I felt the dread of leaving the cabin possibly for the last time, but I was lucky enough to have time to gather my belongings. Then I went to go film the fire. Watching a wall of flames consume an entire section of forest right in front of you is humbling. Veteran firefighters told me the fire behavior they were seeing was extraordinary.
spotting way out ahead of the main fire. In many cases, 80% or more of the embers that landed out ahead of the fire ignited and started new fires, and so which created just a huge, really a firestorm. You know, we've been using the term explosive rates of spread. That's really what we're seeing. We're seeing conditions that certainly in the past decades that we haven't seen. We are experiencing now the fires of the future.
Ultimately, the Butte Fire didn't get our cabin. Some of my neighbors were not as fortunate.
I'm worried about protecting lives and property, and obviously where we're putting our firefighters, because we will continue to protect lives and property, and that just places firefighters and others at greater risk.
This is a very, very special spot for being able to memorialize fallen firefighters. But it's also a memorial to those that have really given their entire life and their career to making it safe and efficient for our firefighters to manage a wildland fire program. It's chilling how many names I recognize that I've known in my career of these people that have died fighting fire.
More than 300 firefighters have died fighting wildland fires since the year 2000. Though we rake and often burn flammable debris, such as pine needles, to create defensible space around our homes, it's easy to imagine the entire area going up in flames. I, for one, don't want firefighters risking their lives protecting my family's cabin. But more and more trees are dying, and the danger of wildfire is increasing.
What we're looking at here today are the symptoms of a very, very big problem that's been occurring for the last 4 to 5 years. And the problem is a drought of cataclysmic proportion. The results of that drought is a severe bark beetle attack. When you combine drought with overstocked forest, the trees become a prime candidate for attack by a bark beetle. Adult beetles lay eggs inside the bark, and those eggs hatch into larvae and kill all the nutrients under the bark, so the roots die, and once the roots are dead, they can't bring water back from the soil up to the top of the tree, and that's what you finally see is the top of the tree turning brown and die. We've got the potential for things that none of us have seen before in the forest in terms of fire, because the fuel loading is going to be absolutely tremendous.
Since the year 2000, bark beetles have consumed 85,000 square miles of forest in the western United States, an area the size of Idaho.
Forests are a victim of climate change, and they're also contributing to global emissions. Our latest research shows that forests globally are as big a source of greenhouse gas emissions as transportation worldwide. Now, why is that? It's because of deforestation and forest fires.
More than 100 bushfires have swept through Australia's New South Wales, forcing thousands to leave their homes.
Both Spain and Portugal have been susceptible to warm, dry conditions that enables these fires to spread so rapidly.
Chile's 2,500 firemen are insufficient. More than 100 active fires are still spreading from central to southern Chile, fanned by a prolonged drought and extreme summer heat.
We are losing forests at a rate which is causing them to be a contributor to the problem of global warming.
Our forests are now on track to lose more carbon than they store. That will accelerate climate change and affect our lives with more extreme weather.
California has set itself ambitious goals for reducing our carbon footprint, and at the same time, our forests are burning up. They are getting in the way of our ability to achieve those goals. Every time we have a big fire, it sets us back. So it's a cycle, and it's a bad cycle that we're in right now.
Forests should be renewable, but with climate change and all the other stuff that's going with it, we could see a large-scale conversion of that forest. In effect, the equivalent over a relatively short period of time of going in and clearing it.
For me, forests are deeply restorative. Yet I find myself fearing for their future and wondering how they can be restored.
The fact is that our forests are tremendous assets to us because they are a huge part of holding water in our major watersheds. And of course, they provide oxygen for the planet as a whole. If we can get people to sit down and say, you know, these forests have been here for a lot longer than we've been here, but what are they going to look like in another 100, 200, 500 years? What do we want to have by way of forests for our children and grandchildren to be able to enjoy, and for other creatures that we share the planet with? It's really important that we try to find some way to get past the debates that currently seem to have everybody kind of frozen in place, and to develop some consensus about what we think we need in the way of healthy, functioning forests.
Everyone here who has a fire background will look and see this is fuel loading. Just
confronted with complex, large-scale problems, it's easy to feel hopeless. But there are solutions, and often they come from local communities with a shared purpose.
The rim fire brought our community together. What our community's done in response to this catastrophe is really try to find ways to agree on what do we do next short term, what do we do in the long term to protect our forests. So what we've done is formed a group called Yosemite Stanislaus Solutions, YSS. And this group is a great cross-section of our community. The Farm Bureau's in it, several environmental groups, including the Sierra Club, the Audubon Society, the Tuolumne River Trust. We have the timber industry in it, Fish and Game's in there. So we have this great cross-section of folks looking at what's wrong in our forests.
How could we, from the local community, find areas of consensus, share that with the Forest Service, and somehow build solutions that would be the least controversial? And that's what we've tried to achieve here locally.
YSS gained Forest Service support for a pilot project to manage 5,000 acres per year in the Stanislaus National Forest, with the goal of restoring forest health.
This is the kind of area that our YSS group is trying to build consensus for. An area that has the large trees protected, that has some areas where we've thinned out and created openings. A healthy forest that provides for diversity, but also has reduced the risk of wildfires, insect infestation, and some of the other threats.
What was our issue yesterday, probably? Fuel was wet, fuel wouldn't burn, it was super shady. So the piece of ground we looked at.
After generations of fire suppression, the Yurok tribe revived the tradition of cultural burning, and they're not doing it alone.
It is awesome that CAL FIRE is coming alongside of the Yurok tribe and coming in to restore our lands. We need help. We can't do it ourselves. We're trying to put fire on the ground and make it safe.
Our community identified fire as the #1 most important thing to have in our community because there was so much brush. We were at risk of just being burned out. Burning had been outlawed. It was my grandmother's generation that if you were caught setting a fire, they would shoot you.
We have been waiting with bated breath for CAL FIRE to come on board, and so it's really nice to see that we're merging our culture and our community along with the outside, agencies. If you look anywhere around you, the earth is smothered out, suffocating. So if we cannot clear that and help the earth breathe, we're all gonna suffer. It feels really good. My heart has been singing for the last 3 days because I'm gonna be able to get down in here next year and gather. I gather traditional foods, acorns, huckleberries, mosquitoes.
The wildlife is coming back to the land because there's things for them to eat. The use of fire in tribal communities, I think, is really starting to open the eyes of people nationwide about the potential use of fire to bring back balanced ecosystems and a preventative tool for wildfire.
YSS helped to organize a replanting effort in the rimfire burn area as part of a reforestation program.
Perfect. So 1, 2, 3. You're right. We are so psyched there are these volunteers that are out here today. We have Girl Scouts, we have Boy Scouts who are from the local area, we have local community members, we have, you name it, soup to nuts, we have them out here planting trees, and we are very excited that they're here.
We're planting trees because the trees that used to be here burned down.
And if you get the shovel most of the way down there, that should be plenty deep.
One of the things that Yosemite Stanislaus Solutions identified is they wanted to use this as an opportunity to engage people and connect them to the forest and to the landscape.
I've never planted trees, and this is my first time, and it's actually really fun once you get to know it.
It's important to plant trees because we need them. The world needs them. Animals need them. For one, squirrels need trees for their homes, and owls do also. This is a ponderosa. They provide food, they provide shelter, they provide oxygen, of course.
There are people out there that want to make the world a better place, that are willing to come out here and hike up mountains and get dirty to do it. It's incredibly inspirational for me. These are the people that I want to work with.
We're planting seeds here. We're planting seeds, not just trees, but seeds for future generations to come.
We need to approach this replanting with some humbleness, and we also need to understand that things have changed. We have a warmer and potentially drier climate that we're faced with.
Things have changed. We are seeing conditions we have never seen before. After 5 years of the worst drought in 7 centuries, the winter of 2016 and 2017 was one of the wettest in California history. Rain and snowmelt flooded roads and eroded burned landscapes, clogging rivers and reservoirs. This was followed by the hottest summer on record. Then, on the morning of October 9th, I woke up in San Francisco and smelled smoke.
Fast-moving wildfires exploding across wine country, forcing tens of thousands to flee their homes.
People did not know which way to go. Embers were just being whipped in a circular direction in the wind that was blowing, and flames ripping through neighborhoods. The fire was jumping house to house to house.
At 5 in the morning, we got the call for the immediate aid, and we started heading up towards the wine country. When we left, we had heard that it was a wildland type fire, that there was a grass fire. It was coming down towards the city.
Those are coming out of the structure.
We had no idea we were going to be confronted with what we eventually saw. The first place we were asked to meet to stage and wait for our assignment was the Kmart, and we got to the parking lot and the entire Kmart was on fire. A 100,000 square foot building right in the middle of the city.
Kmart's just going up.
We didn't even know where to start. We had the hills on fire, the hospital was threatened, the Kmart was burning down. We had to drive for 10, 15, 20 minutes through this burned out subdivision to even find a row of houses that we could even attempt to save.
There must be houses at some point that are still salvageable.
You have this combination of elements. You have the 5 years of the drought. You have the fuel load increasing around this area. You have the population growth into WUI areas. And once the wind picked up, the humidity dropped, and there was some sort of an ignition source, the results were devastating.
I thought the apocalypse was going on. It was just, the winds were 80 mile an hour, just swirling left and right. Stuff was flying. It was a firestorm.
My mother calls me 3:43 to tell me her house is on fire. And I'm in shock, and I'm telling her to run, get out, just get out of the house, because I can't get out. There's fire everywhere, fire outside, fire. I can't get out of my house. I'm telling her I love her, and she tells me she's gonna die. She can't get out of her house. She's gonna die, and then the phone call drops, and I can't get her back on the phone.
By the time the wine country wildfires were contained, almost 9,000 buildings were destroyed and 44 lives were lost.
What we used to imagine only threatening the wildland-urban interface areas, those same type of fire characteristics are now threatening our urban areas. They're coming through our subdivisions, and in this case, it came right into the middle of an urban area. This could be something that takes decades to recover from, and you're gonna see some changes. We learn something from every fire. This is no exception.
The smoke had barely cleared from the wine country fires when wildfires struck Southern California. It was December, but the fire season had not ended. The Thomas Fire forced over 100,000 people to evacuate their homes. "2018 was even worse, with larger, deadlier, and more destructive wildfires. The Camp Fire became an inferno that took 86 lives and destroyed the town of Paradise.
everything's burned. Oh my God, I mean, everything.
Lives and property continue to be lost, and tens of thousands of Californians have been displaced permanently. I am seeing climate refugees in my state, and I wonder what is to come.
These are things that we haven't experienced before, and things are changing, and if we don't change as well, we're going to see this kind of destruction in these types of fires. So we really do have to look for solutions.
The combination of fire suppression and climate change has put wildfire on a collision course with a growing population. And this problem is getting worse. But it's a human problem.
We've all pretty much grown up thinking that we have the ability to suppress all fires, and that's simply not true. We need almost a fundamental shift in our core values to say, we understand. We understand now that many, many years of fire suppression has got us to where we are today, but let's be proactive and say, our values are gonna change.
We can't get rid of fire. The only choices we have with fire is when to have it and what kind of fire do we want. Or do we want to wait for an unplanned ignition under the worst case conditions and then incinerate everything that we care about?
The heroes of today are on the front lines of building consensus, of trying to get fire back into the landscape in a fashion that is good for protecting communities which depend in many cases on resilient forests.
For the rest of my career, that's what I'm going to be about, is trying to work toward a positive change on all sides so our kids have the legacy that we had.
If we don't steward our land, who's going to do that for us?
We all have a stake here, and we need to fix this so we don't lose everything.
We can create the conditions that we know are resilient. Right now, we're at a tipping point, and we need to consciously make that decision one way or the other.
While making this film, I've seen that wildfires affect all of us, whether we realize it or not. In this time of change, we need to work together. Just as landscapes have to become more resilient, so do we.
Okay, we're back. Can you all hear me? Okay. I think I need to go into therapy now. Wow. Yeah, that was remarkable. That was remarkable. You know, I don't know whether to, other than say that was powerful and remarkable, and we will open up the Q&A for questions. I don't see those any questions right now, but while we're waiting for questions, the panel, I need to introduce the panel, and that is Nancy Brown, who is the head of, yes, I will just say, if you have questions, please put them into the Q&A. There should be a Q&A icon down at the bottom there. And I'm going to introduce Nancy Brown, who is the head of Sonoma County Office of Emergency Preparedness. Do I have that right, Nancy?
Community Preparedness Program Manager.
Oh, okay, okay. And then her colleagues, Sam Wallace and Marshall Turbeville. Okay, I think we got you all there and unmuted. Okay, so there we go. So we have Stephen and Kevin, and Marshall and Nancy and Sam are experts and filmmakers. So I see one question in the chat. Let's see here. Well, the first question is a big one by Deborah Doyle, and I believe she is one of our library commissioners. She asking, what is our call to action? So who would like to take that one?
Well, I could just say a handful of things about that. That is a very big question, and I think there are thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of communities throughout the West and the world asking that very same question. I think when we made this film, our call to action was for us to understand that there are solutions, that it's going to take communities working together, that there are some strategies we can take, both in the wildland urban areas, in our wilderness, and in urban areas. And we felt like the best thing we can do is really work locally. One of the things we love to do is these community screenings, because they bring everybody together. You get a chance to listen to, to Sam and Marshall and Nancy and hear what you can do locally. And I'm a big fan of kind of work locally, because I think that's the key to living with wildfire more sustainably. So I'd be curious to think what particularly the three other panelists on the panelists think as well.
Well, I know that Marshall is pretty active with a lot of our community groups, and maybe you can speak to that, Marshall. Getting grants and doing things to really help remove the underbrush. And I don't know, are you guys doing things in forest areas or just in the residential land areas, Marshall?
Yeah, I'll answer that question, and I'll also cover what you just mentioned. So first off, great video, brings back a lot of memories as well. But I would call it a shared responsibility. As a fire chief, a member of government, there's only so much government can do. And then there's what is individual responsibility. So things like defensible space, how you manage the vegetation around your house is going to be on the resident, on the property owner. So that's something you could start as early as right now or tomorrow. That is your responsibility. How your house is built, we call that structural hardening. That's a little bit more complex. It requires money and also someone that knows how to change vents, change windows, change siding. So those two categories are things individuals can do. A great thing to do is to work with your neighbors, and there's different programs from that for community preparedness, because we can do everything we can to prevent a fire from happening, but undoubtedly lightning or an accident's going to happen that's going to create the emergency that people are going to need to be prepared to evacuate, be notified to evacuate, and get out of harm's way. So that's working with neighbors, helping each other out. And then we can talk about how we can partner on grant projects, do larger scale projects away from the area around people's homes, maybe a strategic shaded fuel break, a roadside vegetation project to help people get in and out, firefighters make access, and that's where there's grants available. And the video highlighted the use of prescribed burning. That's where a fire department can help. There's also other groups like Audubon Canyon Ranch's Fire Forward Initiative. There's volunteers now getting involved in prescribed burning. And then there's just a holistic understanding that we all need to support one another, understand that there could be smoke on some days because of prescribed burning, but that's better than having a lot of smoke. I think as someone mentioned September 8th of last year, which then has health effects, affects tourism, affects our livelihood. So it's going to take a holistic approach, everybody working together and agreeing that we're not always going to agree, but we got to find a way, just like the video highlighted, groups that are finding their commonalities and moving forward to be more resilient. And I'll just end on that term resilient. When I'm talking to my children, I just say it's making it through the bad days so we can enjoy the good days. And so whatever we can do now to make the bad days less bad, whatever we can do to work together, that's what I'm all about. And that's what we got to be doing. And that's why these types of videos, documenting where we've been historically, going back to 1900s, 1905, 1910, the big blow up, what we lived through recently, and making sure our future generations understand why this is important. So I don't know if that answered your question, but that's just some of my thought process and kind of my mindset. So thank you.
Thank you.
I would add a couple of things. One is that one should be sure to be on the emergency alert system so that you get information as soon as possible, and be prepared long before that to evacuate. Have a go bag so that you can leave your home, and also be aware of your evacuation routes.